Hello, and I hope you're all doing well. Today is Tuesday, April 14th. Who remembers the date anymore? And this is one final lecture for LGL 130, Intro to the Canadian Legal System. I'm doing it this way because WebEx from Seneca is not available to part-time students. So as you can see, I'm in my full-time office now, and I'm unable to do a WebEx. So I'm just doing it this way. To date, I have not received any questions from anybody. There's obviously any questions relating to content of the exam, just sort of questions about that. So I guess you don't have any specifics, but I'm still going to go through for the next 15 or so minutes, go through content which you should expect to see on the final exam for LGL 130, Intro to the Canadian Legal System. Just so you know, because I have multiple screens now, thankfully, I'm in the office, and believe me, I'm not working at home anymore. I'm an essential service, and I just have to be here with my files and whatnot. So, but I have on a screen open, and I will ask you now to pause, after you've received these instructions, pause to open these windows on your screen as well. So I have open a federal government website of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Constitution Act 1982 from the Department of Justice of Canada website. I have in brief Ontario Justice Education Network Section 1 of the Charter and Oakes Test. I have uploaded that on Blackboard. You should see it on Blackboard. Ran up today. I have that open as well. And I have the exam overview memo, which I sent you and put on Blackboard. I have that open as well. So that's going to guide the discussion of us today. At my side, I also have a copy of the textbook. So we'll use these tools as we go through the video. Okay, so let's get started. And I'm going to go through the memo as we do this, and really just sort of have this open and follow along. Okay, so a little bit of the history of the Constitution. That may appear on the exam, and everything I say is going to may appear. I'm not going to give you any questions, but this is the stuff I want you to know, and stuff that you can use your study sheet to assist you with. So, the history of the Canadian Constitution. You know I love it. Now, this exam is shared with the other class, so I've worked collaboratively with it with the other professor. So it's not going to have a lot of my pet interests, but again, just be cognizant of the larger themes, but also sort of stuff that I like as well. So the history of the Canadian Constitution. We're not going to go back pre-1867 and the Constitution Act 1867. Don't really want to do that. But what we do want you to do is just sort of have a sense of how the Canadian Constitution, unlike our friends down in the States, theirs was a revolutionary action, although not as revolutionary as you might think, because they kept common law. The states down there, the individual states, had what were called reception statutes, which basically said, until we change it, the common law of England applies also to the state of New Jersey, or the state of Delaware, or so on. So they had reception statutes, so it wasn't completely revolutionary. America didn't start from scratch, but Canada started from a lot less scratch, as it were, than the United States. So look at sort of the British and Canadian nature of the Canadian Constitution. The Constitution Act 1867 and the Constitution Act 1982, those are sort of partner constitutional documents with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which of course is part of Constitution Act 1982, form the triumvirate of Canadian constitutional law as we know it now. So I use those two statutes, but you have to be aware of both of them. And again, I know this is sort of basically an open book test because, we ask you to keep a study sheet. I'm not going to say anything more. But you need to have sort of a sense of both of those major entrenched statutes. The POG power, peace, order, and good government. So remember that we had sort of residual power lied in the Canadian state, the Canadian Parliament, okay, the big country, as it were. If it was not designated to the province, it was the head of power was the Federation, the federal Parliament in Ottawa, not Toronto. Contrast that to the United States, where residual powers were kept in the states themselves. Again, I contrast for interest, not because it's going to be on the exam. So nothing about the United States on the exam. Just it's a little point to illustrate things. Okay, laws and constitutional conventions. So we know that the office of the Prime Minister, which is very powerful in Canada, is actually a constitutional convention. Hold on. I'm back. Turn the light on. It was, I thought it was, why is it dark in here? Well, the light wasn't on. So, constitutional conventions. Know the difference between a constitutional convention and a law. So, the office of the Prime Minister, not mentioned in our constitutional documents because it's a convention. It's one that carried over from really the 1740s, I believe, with Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, yeah, there you go. Know the difference between conventions and laws. Have an understanding of the heads of power. So I write here, federal provincial powers. So the heads of power, Section 91 of the Constitution Act 1867, that deals with the federal head, federal head of power, the federal parliament, the federal state. So you'll have those available to you because I suspect they'll be on your study sheet, but you don't have to memorize them. I'll be honest with you, I don't have all of them memorized. I suspect few lawyers actually do. But what you need to know is just sort of who's responsible for what. And realistically, you see this in your everyday life when you deal with money. Money's coinage, minting, that's a federal responsibility, whereas healthcare delivery, is a provincial one, and that's huge now. And so I put that, especially during an emergency like COVID-19. So, think about how does the COVID-19 emergency affect your life as a Canadian, as someone who lives within the country and the constitutional framework that has been set out in Canada. So it's really something for you to consider. Don't discount that there might be some sort of topical questions for you to work through during this evaluation. The constitutional amending formulas, there are 5. What happens if Canada wanted to abolish the Senate, like many people do? It is, I believe, official party policy of the New Democratic Party of Canada, so the NDP, to abolish the Senate. So it's not out of the, it's not an extraordinary idea that we would one day, say in 50 years, get rid of the Senate. Provinces did it a long time ago. There's no upper chambers. House of Councillors, Senate, whatever they called it. There's no upper house in the provinces. Provincial legislatures are unicameral, as the word goes. The federal parliament is bicameral with a Senate and a House of Commons. How do we amend that? So know the amending formulas. What happens if when Queen Elizabeth II passes on? And really, it's looking like she's going to outlive us all. But, what happens if we want to become the Republic of Canada and not have the Queen or the Governor General? What if we want to make the Governor General a president? What happens if a province wants to make a name change? Remember back in the early 2000s, Newfoundland wanted to change its name from Newfoundland to Newfoundland and Labrador. What if we wanted to be called the province of Ontario and the Great Lakes? I don't know. It's something that is unlikely, but what happens if we wanted to do it? How would we make those changes, and so on? Provincial doctrines dealing with conflict and inconsistency. So, maybe it shouldn't be doctrines, but doctrines dealing with conflict and inconsistency. So federal provincial doctrines dealing with conflict and inconsistency. What happens? So those list of doctrines that we've talked about, what happens in the event that a provincial head of power and a federal head of power, if there's a butting of the heads, okay? So how does that work? So you know those doctrines. They're very clearly enunciated in the textbook. I'm not going to go through them now, but you have to have sort of a sense. So just make sure you can identify the doctrines, identify when they become, they're engaged through, what happens, and so on. So just have a sense of that as well. And the Aboriginal section. So dealing with Chapter 7, but remember Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 is not a part of the Charter, but it deals with Aboriginal issues, and just have sort of a broad sense of what this means. Of course, Section 25 is part of the Charter. So that's your Chapter 6 from the textbook. Those are some things to think about. A lot, I know, a lot. So, just keep in mind, you've done 2 tests already with me. You have a sense of sort of how difficult, the questions are, you're not going to be writing, there are in advanced constitutional law classes, you could write for days, and the spilt ink that's been spent on the amending formula of the Canadian Constitution it's probably not quite literally the size of Lake Ontario, not at all, but it's a lot. Okay, so there's obviously you're dealing with questions that are going to be sort of broad, broader themes. So don't feel you need to stress over the amending formulas so much that you neglect everything else. You have to have a balance, but we want sort of a wide-ranging knowledge of these topics, but not so detailed that it could be a PhD paper or something like that. Okay, Chapter 7. Let's move on. We're at 12 minutes, so we got to keep going. Chapter 7, infringing. So let's pause now if you need to, but after that, let's look at the Oakes test and section, the Constitution, Section 1 of the Constitution, and the Ontario Justice Education Network, Section 1 of the Charter and Oakes test. So let's look at that right now and just sort of go down. So I'm going to basically, I'm looking at page 5 of the Ontario Justice Education Network memo, B, justification of limits, the Oakes test, and then I'm going to keep that open, and then I'm going to flick back to the Constitution itself, Constitution, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms itself. So anyway, and let's think about this within the context of what's going on in the wider world. I look out on King Street right now, and normally, and you can see there's the city right there. So back in the corner. But I look out on a city that has very little movement. There's a couple of people walking their dog and going for walks right now, but the city, King Street, and again, I'm not right downtown. I'm located at King and Strawn, so it's it's downtown, but it's not quite. But normally this is very busy. The streetcar is packed, everything. People piling on, leaving from work, going to Liberty Village, going downtown, all that sort of stuff. And there's nobody out there right now. We are in an unprecedented time for my life anyway. So let's look at how this is relevant to the Charter. So Section 1 of the Charter. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So when you look at Section 1 of the Charter, Part 1, Section 1 of the Constitution Act 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights, let's break it down. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it. Set out in it. There it is. Available for you as a Canadian. And other, people, but you get the idea. Subject. Not even in the first sentence, it looks like it's clawing the rights back. Subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law. Subject only to such reasonable limits. So, you're just finishing your first semester, at Seneca, but already you've encountered this word reasonable many times in the study of the law generally. Reasonable. Reasonable. What is reasonable? Okay? So we know now that, not all rights are, absolute, right? I can't do just anything I want. I have to exist within a framework where I am not doing some things because the law doesn't allow me to do everything. And again, you know me, I'm a good guy, I have a good heart, and I don't want to wish ill will on anybody. But at the same time, if I had an unhindered rights, it could lead to trouble. So, reasonable limits prescribed by law. So, reasonable limits prescribed by law. That is a very powerful 5 words. Reasonable limits prescribed by law. So you're all of a sudden what you're doing is you're inviting someone, an expert in law, to prescribe those reasonable limits. Reasonable limits prescribed by law. So we're going to prescribe, using the law, the reasonable limits that we think are required. The reasonable limits prescribed by law, let's add some more. As can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. That's reasonable limits prescribed by law, as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. As can be demonstrably shown, justified. As can be shown to be justified in a free and democratic society. Making it very clear that Canada is a free and democratic society. So basically, Section 1, the guarantee of rights and freedoms in Canada, says that we have these rights in accordance with the Charter set out in the Charter itself, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Okay, so what happened shortly thereafter in 1982 when this new document was presented to the courts to interpret? Because as we know, going back in history, the courts are the interpreters of the law in our system. Well, what happened from that, and I ask you to turn now to the brief, Section 1 of the Charter and Oakes Test, the brief. So I'm reading straight from the brief itself. In the case Crown and Oakes, 1986, the Supreme Court of Canada interpreted the wording of Section 1 and established the basic legal framework of how S1, Section 1, would apply to a case. This 2-part legal test, known as the Oakes test, is applied each time a charter violation is found in order to determine if a law that infringes the charter can be justified under Section 1 of the charter. The Oakes test is outlined as follows. Okay, so recognizing that there was some work to be done here and that they would, let's go back to the wording, prescribed by law and can be demonstrably justified, and prescribed by law, the courts were called upon to, okay, so when can these charter rights be more or less clawed back? So when is the time that for reasonable limits? When is the time that we can, demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society? Keeping in mind that the framework of Canada is always free and democratic. So, the court came out with the Oakes test in number 1. It's a 2-part test with some subsections. So 5 parts. I don't know, but anyway, here it is. So, and at this moment, I also want you to clue in and think, hey, how can this apply to this COVID-19 disaster? Okay, we have seen, if you go to the Charter, and I want you to go to Section 6, Mobility of Citizens, Section 6 of the Charter. Have a look. Every citizen of Canada has the right to enter, remain, and leave Canada. Okay. Rights to move and gain livelihood. Every citizen of Canada and every person who has a status of permanent resident of Canada has the right to A. to move to and take up residence in any province, and to B, pursue the gaining of a livelihood in any province. Okay, so those are very economic focused, right? When you move and take up residence, to move to and take up residence. So, that's sort of your Ontarian. My brother did that. My brother, as you know, I got a job in Calgary and moved to Alberta. And he's been out there for, I think almost 20 years. So, that's sort of how that is engaged. But anyway, so generally, the spirit of this document says that we can move around this country when we can. But right now, currently on the border, the line between Quebec and Ontario, there's Quebec police officers limiting travel of Ontarians who own cottage properties up in Lake Tremblant area and other parts of Quebec. And they are turning back, from what I know, I haven't checked the news recently, but they're turning back travel for non-essential purposes, i.e. cottage purposes, up in parts of Quebec for Ontario cottage owners. Now, they're doing the same here. They're encouraging people not to go to their cottages in Muskoka from Toronto. But we know there's no guards. From what I've seen, there's no police in Barrie stopping people from traveling north. So, that's sort of, a big legal element to this country, is that we can move within it as much as we more or less want to. But what happens if there is a good reason for the government to limit movement on account that if I am coughing up, and you'll notice I'm feeling great, that little cold I got, that little cold I had is gone. But if I want to go up to my cottage, don't have a cottage in Barrie or Muskoka, but what if I did? If I want to go up there, and there's good reason to say, no, Mark, you have to stay back in Toronto. How does that work with law? So this is when we get to the Oakes test here. There must be a pressing, so let's go back to the Oakes test and let's look at it. Number one, there must be a pressing and substantial objection for the law or government action. There must be a pressing and substantial action. Yes. The means chosen must be proportional to the burden of the rights. So it has to be sort of proportionally fair. And then below that, the number one, the objective must be rationally connected to the limit of the charter right. The limit must minimally impair the charter right, so it can't go too far. And there should be an overall balance or proportionality between the benefits of the limit and its negative effects. So, okay. That's it. That's the Oakes test, and that is used across the board when it comes to if they're looking at there is an infringement of the rights of the charter rights on an individual. So you have to know that. It's an important part of it. So, okay, let's get back now to Chapter 7. So think about this during extraordinary times. The charter rights themselves, you can just go through them on the website, or in the charter rights are found in the textbook. Know that they're applicable to government action, and how sort of the charter is all about government action. It's not a civil it's not a civil law instrument. It is a public law instrument. So it deals with with police, with the government. And so on and so forth. Look for remedies, how one would seek remedies for a charter breach, and just have a sense of sort of the Aboriginal sections, which I talked about in Chapter 6 as well. Criminal law. Let's move on to Chapter 10. And so, in this one here, you can follow the criminal law section of the book quite closely here. So just know the big, actus reus and the mens rea. So, the guilty mind, the guilty act, have a sense of that. Who prosecutes, who investigates, right? So we know the cops, we know the crowns, we know how that works. Look at incomplete sentences, what happens with attempted murder, that type of thing. Accessories after the facts, aiding and abetting, all that sort of stuff, have a sense there. who's going to be charged for a certain offense and what defenses you have. Mistake of fact. What are the other ones? Automatism, provocation, duress, necessity, self-defense, mental disorder. Section 16, the Monotone test. Section 16 is a codified version of the Monotone test, which goes back to the 1840s. It is a legal test, not a medical test. Intoxication, mistake of fact, and so on. So just have a sense of all those defenses, and you'll be fine for the criminal section. And finally, Chapter 13 in Human Rights, just sort of have a sense of the history of human rights in Canada. Edwards in Canada, I put in there as a case, that you should know, just not for this test, but people should just know about the famous 5 generally. I mean, that is a big moment in Canadian history, let alone Canadian law. So, human codes generally, what's the point of a human rights code, as opposed to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as opposed to the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations? Sort of what is the code? So, you know that the code is all about sort of it's a civil matter. If somebody is performing or is doing things in a way that is unacceptable in the workplace, and human rights are clearly violated, that is a code related offense. So you have to have a sense of that as well. And there's a long portion of the chapter about the future of human rights codes. Just have a sense of the future of human rights, conflicting rights, and of course, as it relates to bona fide occupational requirements and employment discrimination. So you should have these things readily available on your study sheet and in there. So I haven't quite determined the time of when I'm going to release the assignment, but it's going to come at you on Thursday now. Okay, so well, it was always Thursday, but and you'll have 24 hours later. So to do it, and then that'll be worth 15 marks, and will involve some detailed, which as I put here, there'll be a fact pattern, smaller questions to deal with, and then write it well, because we'll be dealing with grammar as well, and then from there. The overall exam, you will be instructed by the exam, and I will post something that says you must be compliant with our academic honesty requirements. Again, we can't police you, but we ask that you do the right thing, and it's never a wrong reason to do the right thing. You will see things through the course of your career within the justice system. You will hear things that must not be mentioned to your friends. You will be, who knows, you could be be drawn into a situation where your ethical code may be tested. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that you do the right thing. So start today. Start during these extraordinary times. The test itself is a mix of multiple choice and short answer. It will be released online. You will have to do it. Probably I'm going to do it in the afternoon on Friday, because I know you have a test in the morning. But you'll be given 12 hours to do it. Once you start, you'll have that 2 hours to do. So go to the bathroom, have a coffee or whatever beforehand, and make sure you save after every answer, because we're getting some feedback. But you'll know the stuff better than me. You'll have already done it before. I'm still new. But anyway, so I will stop there. It's 29 minutes, and so I wish you the very best. Sorry we couldn't do this via webcast, but I appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed our class time together. So thank you very much for being a great group. You've been tested this semester for sure. It hasn't been easy on any of us with what's going on out there. But be well, take care, wash your hands, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.